On the evening of November 7, 1876, the editors of the New York Times went to bed believing that Samuel Tilden had won the presidency of the United States. They were not alone. Most of the country believed the same thing. Tilden, the Democratic governor of New York, had won the popular vote by more than 250,000 ballots, a margin that, in any previous American election, would have been decisive. The Associated Press had already called the race. Champagne was being uncorked in Democratic headquarters across the country. The headline was written. The president was named. By morning, the headline had not run. Someone, in the hours between midnight and dawn, had made a different decision. His name was Daniel Sickles, a Republican operative, a former general who had lost a leg at Gettysburg, a man whose personal history was colorful enough to fill several separate scandals. And he had sent telegrams, in the early hours of November 8th, to Republican Party officials in 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The telegrams carried a single, urgent instruction: hold your state. What followed those telegrams was not an election. It was a negotiation. And the negotiation lasted, in its various formal and informal stages, for 323 days, from the contested morning after election night in November 1876 to the final withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana in April 1877, the last act in a sequence of events that ended Reconstruction, handed the American South to a new political order, and established the framework of racial subjugation that would govern American life for the next 90 years. This is not a forgotten episode. It appears in history textbooks. It has a name: the Compromise of 1877, sometimes called the Corrupt Bargain. It is acknowledged, in the academic literature, as one of the most consequential moments in American political history. What it does not appear in, with any frequency, is the conversation about how American democracy actually functions, about who holds power, how power changes hands, and what happens in the space between the public decision and the private arrangement that determines what the public decision actually means. To understand what the 323 days were, you have to understand what the election of 1876 actually produced, which was not a result, but a crisis. The popular vote, as noted, went to Tilden. But the Electoral College was contested. 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, submitted 2 competing sets of electoral votes, one Democratic and one Republican, each certified by different state authorities claiming legitimacy. A 4th state, Oregon, had its own procedural dispute. Without a clear Electoral College majority, the election could not be certified, and the Constitution of 1876 provided no mechanism that everyone agreed upon for resolving exactly this situation. Congress, under pressure and in the absence of any clear constitutional procedure, created a special electoral commission, 15 members, drawn equally from the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court, with the 15th member intended to be a politically independent justice. Through a sequence of events that the independent justice himself found sufficiently troubling that he withdrew from the commission rather than participate, the 15th seat was filled by a Republican. The commission voted on every disputed question along strict party lines, 8-7, in favor of Hayes. This was, on its surface, a legal resolution. The commission had been created by law, had followed its procedures, and had reached a decision. Rutherford Hayes would be president. But the Democrats in the House of Representatives had the power to prevent the certification from proceeding, to run out the clock through procedural obstruction, until the constitutional deadline for the inauguration passed, and the country would face a genuine constitutional crisis with no president at all. And they had, in the weeks following the commission's decision, every indication of using that power. The question of how that obstruction was prevented, how the Democratic House was persuaded to allow the certification to proceed, is the question that the 323 days are really about. The conventional account of the Compromise of 1877 centers on a meeting at the Wormley Hotel in Washington on the evening of February 26, 1877, a gathering of Republican representatives and Southern Democratic congressmen at which, the standard history tells us, a deal was struck. Hayes would become president, and in return, federal troops would be withdrawn from the remaining Reconstruction states of Louisiana and South Carolina, ending the federal government's active enforcement of Reconstruction-era civil rights protections across the South. The Wormley Hotel meeting is real. The deal made there is documented. It is, in the academic literature, treated as the decisive moment, the handshake across the table that resolved the constitutional crisis and allowed the republic to function. What deserves more careful attention is what the Wormley Hotel meeting actually was. Not the beginning of a negotiation, but the formal conclusion of one that had been underway, in various configurations and venues, for the better part of 4 months. The real negotiation, the one that produced the conditions under which the Wormley Hotel agreement was possible, was conducted not in a hotel conference room, but in a series of private meetings, informal conversations, and written communications between Republican Party operatives, Democratic power brokers from the former Confederate States, and a network of Northern business and railroad interests whose stake in political stability in the South was, by 1876, both enormous and largely unacknowledged in the public discussion of the crisis. Tom Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad and one of the most powerful private citizens in America in 1876, was a central figure in this network. Scott wanted a transcontinental railroad route through the South, the Texas and Pacific Line, which required federal land grants and political cooperation from Southern states that the contested election had left in uncertain alignment. His interests, and the interests of the broader Northern capital investment in Southern economic development, aligned precisely with the outcome that the compromise produced, a stable Southern political order controlled by the Democratic Party, with the federal government's commitment to civil rights enforcement quietly withdrawn. Whether Scott and his associates drove the compromise, or simply benefited from it, or some combination of the two, is a question that the documentary record approaches but does not definitively resolve. What is clear is that the private interests present in the negotiation were never part of the public account of how the crisis was settled. The Wormley Hotel meeting was presented to the public as a political compromise between parties. The economic architecture behind it, who wanted what, who stood to gain from the withdrawal of federal troops, who was in communication with whom across the months of negotiation, was not presented at all. The withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana on April 24, 1877, the event that marks, conventionally, the end of the 323 days and the formal conclusion of Reconstruction, was not, in its immediate physical reality, the movement of large numbers of soldiers. By 1877, the federal military presence in the South had already been substantially reduced from its post-Civil War peak. The symbolic force of the withdrawal was, in some respects, greater than its military one. What the withdrawal ended was not primarily a military occupation. It ended the federal government's active commitment to enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the amendments that guaranteed equal protection under the law and the right to vote regardless of race, in the states of the former Confederacy. In practical terms, this meant that the institutions which had been established during Reconstruction to make those guarantees real, the Republican-aligned state governments in the South, the biracial legislatures, the black office holders who had been elected to positions from Justice of the Peace to United States Senator during the Reconstruction years, were left without the federal backing that had been, in many cases, the only thing protecting them from the organized violence that the opponents of Reconstruction had been deploying systematically since the early 1870s. The organizations through which that violence was conducted, the Ku Klux Klan in its first incarnation, the White League, the Red Shirts, had not been defeated. They had been partially suppressed by federal enforcement action during the Grant administration, most notably under the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which had allowed the federal government to prosecute Klan violence as a civil rights matter. The withdrawal of federal commitment did not formally repeal those laws. It simply ceased to enforce them. The effect, in the states where it played out, was swift and comprehensive. The Republican governments in Louisiana and South Carolina fell within weeks of the troop withdrawal. Black voters who had participated in elections throughout the Reconstruction period found themselves subject to the full range of suppression tools, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the direct threat of economic and physical violence that the new Democratic state governments were free to deploy without federal interference. The political gains of a decade were erased, in many cases, within a single electoral cycle. This was not an accident of history. It was the intended outcome of the arrangement made in the 323 days between November 1876 in April 1877. The men who negotiated the compromise knew exactly what the withdrawal of federal enforcement would mean. The documents they left behind are explicit enough on the point to leave no ambiguity. The formal end of Reconstruction created something that is worth naming precisely. It created a power vacuum in the governance of approximately one-third of the United States, and it created it deliberately. The vacuum was not empty for long. The Democratic Party organizations of the former Confederate States, the Redeemer governments, as they called themselves, drawing on the language of liberation to describe what was, in practice, the restoration of a social and economic order built on racial hierarchy, moved quickly to consolidate control. The instruments of that consolidation were both legal and extra-legal, and the combination proved effective with a thoroughness that the subsequent century would demonstrate. But the vacuum was not filled only by Southern Democrats. It was also filled, gradually and less visibly, by the Northern economic interests whose stake in Southern stability had been part of the negotiation from the beginning. The railroad lines were built. The extractive industries, timber, turpentine, coal, cotton, expanded into the South under arrangements that gave Northern capital access to Southern resources and Southern labor under conditions that the Reconstruction governments, had they survived, might have regulated or resisted. The sharecropping system and the convict leasing system, which emerged in the post-Reconstruction South as the dominant forms of agricultural and industrial labor organization, produced returns for their investors that were, in strict economic terms, competitive with the slave labor they replaced. The connection between the political decisions of the 323 days and the economic architecture of the post-Reconstruction South is not a speculative one. It is documented in the business records, the congressional testimony, and the correspondence of the individuals involved. Tom Scott's Texas and Pacific Railroad received its land grants. The lumber and mining companies received their access. The labor systems that made those industries profitable received their protection from the new state governments, which were, in turn, free to operate without the federal oversight that Reconstruction had provided. Who held power after the 323 days were over is a question with at least two answers. The visible answer is the Democratic Party in the South. The less visible answer is the network of Northern and Southern economic interests whose preferences had shaped the negotiation and who benefited, for generations, from its outcome. There is something worth examining in the language that American historical education has used over the decades since 1877 to describe what happened in the 323 days. The Compromise of 1877 is the standard term. The word compromise implies mutuality, two parties, each giving something up, each receiving something in return. In the conventional framing, the Republicans gave up Reconstruction and the Democrats gave up their obstruction of Hayes's certification. Both parties, in this reading, made a painful concession for the sake of national stability. This framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it omits the parties who were not at the table and who gave up something without being asked. The 4 million Black Americans who had been citizens, voters, and office holders during Reconstruction, who had built churches and schools and political organizations under the fragile protection of federal enforcement, were not represented in any negotiation at the Wormley Hotel or in any of the private communications that preceded it. What they lost in the compromise was not something they conceded. It was something that was conceded for them by people who did not consult them and whose interests were not, in any meaningful sense, aligned with theirs. The choice to call this event a compromise, rather than a surrender or a bargain or a betrayal, is a choice that shapes how the event is understood and, more importantly, how the system that produced it is understood. A compromise is a reasonable outcome of a reasonable process. A surrender of one group's rights by another group that had been entrusted with their protection is something else, something for which the historical vocabulary tends to reach less readily. The political scientist Ari Berman, writing about the long legacy of the 1877 settlement, has argued that the removal of federal voting rights enforcement in the South after Reconstruction established a template, a set of political arrangements and legal precedents that shaped the structure of American democracy for the next century and whose echoes extend into the present. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, in his analysis, an attempt to undo, 90 years later, what the 323 days had done. Whether it fully succeeded is a question that subsequent decades have continued to complicate. What the 323 days reveal, when examined as a process rather than as an event, is something about how fundamental changes in the structure of American power tend to occur. They do not tend to occur at the moments that are publicly celebrated as transformations, the inaugurations, the signings, the speeches. They tend to occur in the spaces between those moments, in the negotiations that precede the public agreement, in the private communications between parties whose interests are not declared, in the administrative decisions and non-decisions that determine what a publicly agreed principle will actually mean when it is applied. The 323 days were, in this sense, not an exception to American political history. They were an especially well-documented example of a recurring pattern, the pattern by which the outcome that appears in the public record diverges, sometimes slightly and sometimes enormously, from the outcome that was produced by the actual distribution of interests and power in the room where the decision was made. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th, remained in the Constitution throughout the post-1877 period. They were not repealed. They were not formally suspended. They were, instead, allowed to become inoperative through the withdrawal of enforcement, through the appointment of federal judges who interpreted them narrowly, through the development of legal doctrines like separate but equal that gave the text of equality a meaning entirely contrary to its intent. The Constitution said one thing. The governance of the country did another. And the gap between those two things was maintained, for 90 years, by a political arrangement made in private, in the winter of 1876 and 1877, by men whose names most Americans would not recognize. The 323 days between November 1876 and April 1877 are not a mystery in the sense of being hidden. The documents exist. The scholarship is extensive. The events can be reconstructed in considerable detail by anyone willing to spend time in an archive or a university library. What they are is something slightly different from hidden. They are overlooked, passed over, in the standard account of American political development, in favor of the cleaner narrative in which democracy corrects itself through its own mechanisms, in which the arc of history bends reliably toward justice, in which the gap between constitutional promise and political reality is always, eventually, closed by the process rather than maintained by it. The 323 days suggest a different reading. They suggest that the process, at certain moments, is exactly the mechanism by which the gap is opened and maintained, that the constitutional promise and the political reality can diverge not through the failure of the system, but through its operation, through the deliberate and sophisticated use of the system's own procedures to produce an outcome that the system's stated values would not endorse. And the question that the 323 days leave open, the one that the subsequent history of American democracy keeps returning to in different forms and different contexts, is not whether this has happened before. It has. The documentation is clear. The question is simpler and less comfortable than a historical inquiry tends to permit. When the gap between what is promised and what is delivered is opened not by the failure of democracy, but by its procedures, when the mechanism of constitutional governance is used, with precision and sophistication, to produce an outcome that the Constitution was designed to prevent, what, exactly, do you call what you are living in? And if the answer has changed since 1877, the next question is, when, and how, and who decided?